Good morning, readers. Today we will be talking about narrative nonfiction. If you haven't already, go ahead and get out your reading, learning, intention sheet. Today's date is 11/17. If you know the book that you're reading, go ahead and fill it in right here. And today is a reader I am working on, and you're going to fill in using all I know about reading fiction to read narrative nonfiction. Readers, last week we talked about how narrative nonfiction has some parts that are similar to fiction books. Remember, we talked about the characters that are in both fiction books and narrative nonfiction books. We decided that narrative nonfiction books also have a setting, and that narrative nonfiction books have a problem and a solution. Today, we're going to focus in a little bit more on these three parts and talking about how we can learn more about these three parts. So we're going to start with characters. And we're going to use the face-to-face book to talk about characters. But first, we need to think of some questions that we would ask ourselves about characters. Turn and tell your partner something that you could ask to get to know a character better in a narrative nonfiction book. Do that now. Readers, one question that we can ask ourselves to get to know the characters is, what does the character need? Another would be, what does the character or the person wish or hope for? And then we could also ask ourselves, what are the traits, and then some evidence of those traits. So I told you that we would be using the Face-to-Face with Wolves book. I'm going to read a little bit aloud to you today. I grew up on the flat and treeless prairie. That's where I first began dreaming about seeing a wild wolf. Wolves were my favorite animals as a boy, even though they were extinct on the prairie. I had seen them only in photos and paintings. When I was finally old enough to drive, I set out for the north woods of Minnesota. I knew wolves still lived there, and I hoped to photograph one, but I could not find any in the deep, dense woods. They were there, of course, but I didn't know how to look for them. Now on the next page it says, years later, I jumped at the chance to travel the high Arctic far north in Canada for National Geographic. The white wolves there are usually not afraid of people, since they see so few humans they are curious about us. When I arrived on Ellesmere Island just west of Greenland, I saw my first pack of 7 white Arctic wolves. I followed them as they headed towards an iceberg. The leader of the pack was the first to see me. He looked at me without fear, letting me know there was no way I would sneak up on him. He went on walking and climbing to what was clearly his favorite spot on the iceberg, a shelf halfway up. He sat down to watch me, still clumsily trying to catch up to him. When I got as close to him as I could, we stared at each other. I looked at him through my powerful telephoto lens. After all these years, I was finally face to face with my favorite animal. During that first summer, the wolves became used to seeing me around. I felt like I was part of the pack. I was able to follow them as they hunted musk oxen and then brought the food back to feed their pups. 6 cute little waddling gray bundles of fur. I watched the pups romp and play. All right, readers. Now, we're going to look at these 2 pages and think, what does the character need? As I'm looking at these, I'm thinking that he really needs to learn more about wolves, or he would really like to. And then when I think about the next question, what does this person wish or hope for? I'm thinking that he really wishes to see wolves for himself. And it even says that on page 5. And then finally, we want to think about traits that the character has. So, as I think about this character, this main character in this book, I'm going to think about character traits. And I'm thinking that one trait that he might have is that he perseveres. That means he keeps on trying, because he went to Minnesota to find wolves, but he didn't see one. And so then he went to the Arctic, as it says on page 6, to see wolves, and he was able to see them there. So he persevered. Boys and girls, I want you to think of another character trait. Go ahead and do that now. Readers, I stated that the main character in this book was persistent. He went to many places to find wolves. As I was reading, I also realized that he's patient. He waited for the wolves. And I also think that he's knowledgeable. He knows a lot about wolves. Next, we're going to think about the setting of the story. Now, when you're thinking about the setting, you need to think about where the story takes place and when the story takes place. Go ahead and talk to your reading partner about that now. Readers, the story begins with the author talking about living in Minnesota and looking for wolves there, and then continues to talk about living in the Arctic Circle in Canada. We want to be really specific with our setting. Where else does the story take place? Readers, I added that it also takes place on Ellesmere Island. Finally, we want to think about what is the setting like? And as we read, we learned that it was cold and snowy, and I was also getting the idea that it was in the wilderness. The next question that we want to ask ourselves is, when did the story take place? Take a peek at the pages and think, when did this story take place? Readers, you'll notice that it doesn't give us an exact year. However, it does seem like it takes place in modern times. And the author seems to be an adult, and he's talking a little bit about when he was a boy and when he was a younger adult. So it could have been possibly 20 or 30 years ago, because he does say on page 6 at the end, after all these years. So it does make it seem like it was a few years ago, possibly 10 to 30 years ago. So we are going to add that in. So modern times, about 10 to 30 years ago, when the author was a younger adult. All right. Finally, readers, we have to look at the problem and the solution. We're just going to use these 2 pages to think about the problem and the solution. And as I'm reading it, I notice on the first page that he is talking a lot about wanting to see wolves. He even talks about going to Minnesota to see the wolves. I set out for the north woods of Minnesota. I knew wolves still lived there, and I hoped to photograph one. And then it goes on to say, but I could not find any in the deep, dense woods. They were there, of course, but I didn't know how to look for them. What's the problem in this section of the story? That's right, readers. He's looking for wolves. He really wants to see one, but he can't. So that is our problem. Then we need to think about our solution, and a solution just means how that problem was solved or fixed. So he really wanted to see wolves, and he couldn't in Minnesota. So he ends up going to the Arctic in Canada, specifically to Ellesmere Island, and he does see a pack of wolves. He sees Arctic wolves there. So that is how he solved his problem. He went to another location and found wolves and was able to follow that pack there. So that would be an example of a problem and solution in a narrative nonfiction book. As you read nonfiction, or narrative nonfiction, I want you to think about these same things. I want you to think about the characters and think about what they want or what they hope for or wish for. I want you to think about the setting, think about where it takes place and when it takes place, but also think about what it was like. And finally, I want you to think about the problem and solution. Readers, I would like you to write about these things in your stop and jots. Let's make it a great reading day.